Stocks tumble after bleak data highlights pandemic's economic impact. Stocks tumbled on Wednesday as investors faced a stream of bad news about the economic damage caused by efforts to contain the coronavirus pandemic, including data that showed a historic plunge in retail sales and a slump in factory output. The S&P 500 dropped more than 2%. Stocks in Europe were also lower, and Asia had a downbeat day. The retreat Wednesday came the day after the S&P 500 hit a one-month high. Though still far from the record reached on February 19, stocks in the United States have been steadily climbing in recent weeks as investors have begun to focus on the prospect of an eventual rebound from the economic collapse set off by the pandemic. But on Wednesday, they were confronted by a number of reports that highlight just how badly the economy is faring. The Commerce Department said that retail sales in March dropped 8.7% as consumers were forced to stay home. And Federal Reserve said industrial production and manufacturing output in the United States fell by the most since 1946. The German Economy Ministry said economic output in Europe's largest economy was likely to plunge almost 10% from April through June. As they reported earnings, the nation's banks also raised more warnings about the potential for a wave of defaults on loans, saying that they are stockpiling cash in anticipation of losses. Bank of America and United States Bancorp both dropped more than 6% after reporting results. JP Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo, which reported a downbeat report yesterday, were also sharply lower. Goldman Sachs, which reported better than expected results on Wednesday, was a relative standout with a small gain after its trading unit performed better than expected in the first quarter. The collapse in American retail sales slammed the stocks of apparel retailers. Nordstrom, Brands, and Gap all fell sharply. For all the drama of collapsing output, demand, and jobs in Australia and many economies around the globe, we should expect that output in most countries will begin to recover once new coronavirus infections peak and head down. It will not be soon, but it will happen. This is, after all, a deliberate economic recession, one created and encouraged by governments to slow the spread of the virus. There is no reason to expect any extensive destruction of the physical capital on which resumed output growth will depend, and no reason to expect workers to lose skills and knowledge. For what matter, there is no reason to expect any big change in what we buy, what we produce, what kind of work we do. Or in global trade and investment, compared to the patterns a few months ago, China, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Japan are already heading back to work. Bar a major financial disruption, certainly a possibility, but when central banks are alert to control, much of the rest of the world will also be back at work before the end of the year. Yet, for all the likely similarities, it is also apparent that we will be in a somewhat different world. One difference will be a big increase in debt. Coming out of this slump, the level of output will be down and government debt vastly up. On numbers from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, gross government debt was 136% of United States GDP in 2018 and 66% of Australian GDP. We should expect that in a year or so it will be well over 150% of United States GDP and 80% of Australian GDP. Australia's government debt to GDP will be similar to Germany's, while the United States will be similar to France and Italy. For a few years, these ratios will probably continue to increase. At the same time, households are to be likely adding to debt and running down savings. Borrowers who need it may be able to get mortgage repayments postponed, but the amounts will be added to their debt. Other families will have to borrow on their houses or run down offset balances. All up, we should expect to see Australian household debt, already 120% of GDP, creep up. In this respect, Australia is an outlier mainly because of our preference for buying as opposed to renting homes. Even so, most advanced economies should expect to see a big rise in net household debt as consumers try to sustain their spending despite falling income. On Tuesday, the United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said the coronavirus pandemic is the greatest challenge that the world has faced since the Second World War. More than 150 countries, many of them ill-equipped to battle the virus, are already gravely affected. Guterres predicted as a result enhanced instability, enhanced unrest, and enhanced conflict. In the United States, President Trump and his advisors now concede that more than 200,000 Americans could die, and businesses are bracing for a recession that will make the 2008 crisis look like a cold, as one prominent economist told me this week. On Thursday at 8:30 a.m. came the staggering news that a record 6.6 million Americans had filed for unemployment last week, meaning that 10 million Americans have lost their jobs in just the first 14 days of this coronavirus recession. Yet, less than an hour after this awful revelation, in the midst of a week that must surely count as one of the grimmest of his lifetime, Donald Trump was whining on Twitter about crying Chuck Schumer and the complainers at the center of the epidemic in New York, who should have been stocked up and ready long before this crisis hit. By Thursday evening, he was grousing about witch hunt after witch hunt after witch hunt launched by Democrats against him. The day before, when more than 1,000 Americans died of the disease, the president staged a bizarre photo opportunity with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, and other national security leaders to announce an oddly timed opening of a major new front in America's war on Mexican drug cartels. During the event, Trump extemporized about what he often calls his big beautiful wall on the southern border and its tremendous impact, and announced that he would deploy various Navy and Coast Guard ships for the new drug fighting mission. He also bragged about his #1 status on Facebook, accused the former Secretary of State John Kerry of violating the law by advising Iran, and lamented yet again that no one could have possibly foreseen the global pandemic that nearly every global health leader had been warning about for years. After this performance, I received a note from a former senior State Department official in the Trump administration. Seriously, WTF? A new war on drugs? These people have so lost the plot, it's beyond parody. Foreign Policy later reported that the whole thing had been just what it seemed to be, a political optics play by the president. Dodd was against it. A former Trump administration official told the magazine, "Didn't matter to POTUS." When you are done being angry about all the crazy, nasty, inconsistent, and untrue things that Donald Trump says each day about the coronavirus and other matters, remember that the flood of words is cover for an administration that in some ways barely exists relative to its predecessors, especially when it comes to crucial areas of domestic, economic, and international security, or even straightforward crisis management. Turnover at the upper levels of Trump's White House stand at 83%. According to Brookings Institution tracker, in his cabinet, Trump has had far more turnover than President Ronald Reagan, Barack Obama, and George Bush. The capacity of the federal government to respond to this catastrophe, even if Trump had been so inclined, has never been weaker. The virus was not of Trump's making, but his government's incoherent, disorganized response to it was utterly predictable. One bright spot, food and beverage stores posted a record 25.6% surge as Americans stocked up on essential goods. Sales also rose at health and personal care stores, general merchandise stores, and non-store retailers. But most categories were down sharply, with clothing stores sales falling by half, while restaurants and bars were down 26.5%. When you shut an economy down, you're basically turning the lights off. So aside from grocery stores and whatever they can get online, there's really not much going out there, said Joshua Shapiro, chief United States economist at Mario Fiorini Ramirez Inc. At some stage, when the economy starts to reopen, you're going to get a bounce, but the bounce is not going to come anywhere close to replacing what was lost for a long time. United States stocks fell while 10-year Treasury yields were lower and the dollar strengthened. JP Morgan Chase & Co. said in a note that it continues to expect a 40% annualized decline in gross domestic product in the second quarter. Two surveys released Wednesday highlighted the effects of economic shutdowns. The New York Fed's General Business Conditions Index, covering manufacturers in the state, tumbled 56.7 points to minus 78.2, the lowest in records back to 2001. United States home builder sentiment plunged in April to the lowest level in almost 8 years as the pandemic kept potential buyers quarantined and paralyzed construction, according to the latest National Association of Home Builders Wells Fargo Housing Market Index. The March data is bad, but the April data is likely to be even worse because for a good half of March, things were still open, said Michael Gapin, chief United States economist at Barclays plc. United States retailers suffered a record decline in sales last month. Another bleak economic reckoning from the coronavirus pandemic arrived on Wednesday, the biggest one-month plunge in United States retail sales in the nearly 3 decades of record keeping. Grocery stores, pharmacies, and other sellers of essential items experienced a surge of demand last month, but that was outweighed by a steep decline in other categories. As businesses shuttered and shoppers restricted their spending, the Commerce Department's preliminary report showed a seasonally adjusted drop of 8.7% from February's total sales, which include purchases in stores and online, auto and gasoline sales, and money spent at bars and restaurants. Spending on cars and car parts fell by more than 25% in March. Sales at gas stations, pushed down by low oil prices as well as reduced commuting, fell 17%. And sales at clothing stores fell by more than half. Even those bleak figures do not fully capture the economic deep freeze. Most states did not issue shutdown orders to non-essential businesses until late March or early April, meaning data for the current months could be worse still. Until now, the largest one-month downturn in retail sales came in the fall of 2008, when the financial crisis led spending to fall nearly 4% for 2 straight months. A Fed survey shows businesses don't expect a rapid recovery. Companies painted a picture of major economic upheaval in the Federal Reserve's April survey of businesses across the United States, which cited the term coronavirus dozens of times. The Fed publishes this anecdotal survey 8 times a year in what's called the Beige Book. The latest reports speak to how the virus and the mass quarantines in place to halt its spread have disrupted every aspect of American economic life. Cotton producers may shift into wheat as shoppers demand bread and pasta, but clothing retail slows. According to the report, vehicle sales in the New York region dropped to near zero, and businesses slashed capital spending plans. Few businesses seem to forecast a rapid rebound. In the Fed's Chicago district, companies expected the recovery to still be underway a year from now. And in the San Francisco region, many businesses expected heightened slack in the labor market going forward, eliminating any prior upward pressure on wage and price growth. The Philadelphia region summed it up like this: uncertainty clouds outlooks as firms wait for the COVID-19 threat to subside.
Most of the idea, comment, information, and criticism containing in these videos have been created by Daily News Report. Before making any important investment decision, use the information contained in these videos as a starting point for conducting your own research. If you make any investment or legal decision, it is advised to consult an expert before making this decision.